Today we sort of go across the pond to help us better understand the American South. We welcome a special guest to take on the South, an absolutely prolific historian of the American South whose work has done so much to expand our understanding of race relations in the 20th century, the workings of segregation and desegregation, and transatlantic relations, especially the purported UK-US special relationship. He is author of dozens of articles and several books, including the very well-received Fight Against Fear, Southern Jews and Black Civil Rights, and Rabble, Rousers, the American Far Right in the Civil Rights Era. He has also written on lynching and mob violence against Mexican Americans, among many other topics. His research has appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and he is Professor of Modern American History at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. He is Professor Clive Webb, and we are delighted to have him on the show. Clive, welcome to Take on the South.
Thank you so much, Mark.
You're here to lecture and to talk to the University of South Carolina this week, but I feel very lucky that we have you on the podcast, so thank you for doing that. Before we get into some of the details of your work, can you just sort of summarize, what would be your elevator speech? This is what I do and why I do it.
I think of myself as an historian of the United States in broad terms, and specifically, I started out as an historian really of the American South, and have moved away from that a little bit in recent years, and have become more interested in the transatlantic nature of history. And I suppose there's an autobiographical element to that, which is, I am a British historian of the United States, so I've become more interested in reflecting on my own country's relationship with the US.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you know why you shifted from a very heavy Southern focus to a more national transatlantic focus? Is that really a reflection of what's happening in the field, or was there another reason?
I did it for a couple of reasons. I think that, one of them was just a practical one. It's, I'm getting longer in the tooth.
Aren't we all, my friend?
I have more personal responsibilities than I used to. Funding is difficult to access. And so, the idea of continually getting on board transatlantic flights coming over doing the research has become less appealing over the course of time as I've got a bit older. And I've also, candidly, I have struggled to gain the purchase I would have liked as a foreigner within the academy on this side of the Atlantic. It's a challenge, and I think it's one that very few British scholars ultimately achieve, those who are not educated on this side of the Atlantic. And as I say, I think I just became more interested in a way of using history to interrogate my own complicated feelings about the United States. And so, when I talk about the supposed special relationship between Britain and the US, it's a way, in part, reading between the lines, of investigating my own ideas and opinions and prejudices.
Okay, you've opened up a lot there. Let me dig into just one of those things. Your work is very well respected here, right? You're read, you're here for that reason. Why do you think, or why is it your feeling that you haven't had the kind of purchase that you wanted? I actually disagree with you. I think that you've had lots of purchase, but I do understand what you're saying in terms of when you're not in the system here and you're not teaching in the US system, there is a kind of distancing. But you, of all people, know very well that British historians of the American South and the US generally have had a pretty good run, right? We've had many major historians in the UK whose voices have purchase, who have a certain authority, and perhaps even more authority in a way by virtue of being outsiders. Or am I off the track there?
No, I there's a couple of interesting lines of inquiry there, Mark. Certainly there have been some stellar historians of the American South who've come out of Britain. My own PhD supervisor, Tony Badger, among them. But, Adam Fairclough, Brian Ward, more recently the likes of Emily West.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was a moment when those scholars had. I mean, I remember reading a review of a book by, I think it was Stephen Tuck, who I went to university with, and it talked about a British invasion, and as though Steve and myself and others were the equivalent of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Very flattering, entirely misleading.
Lots of screams.
Absolutely, that's what I wanted. The moment I got off the plane, I was expecting groupies to be everywhere.
They were just in the wrong place, Clive, weren't they? They got the airport wrong.
So I think there was this moment, and that came in part because of an intellectual mission, I suppose, that some of those scholars of the generation of Adam Fairclough and Tony Badgett, Michael O'Brien would be another one, that they wanted to write the history of the United States in a way that would be indistinguishable from the approach taken by their American peers. It would be work that was deeply rooted in archival sources, and would look at the US from the inside out, as opposed to the fact they were British from the outside in. I mean, most scholarship on the United States that was produced before the 1980s, really, tended to be based on secondary sources produced by American scholars. So there was a sense of detachment there. It was really synthetic work. This was something new that succeeded in being treated seriously by American-born and educated scholars. I do think that moment has started to pass, despite the presence of some younger scholars still in the academy. But for a number of reasons, some of which I've intimated already, I think that there was a kind of watershed moment, and that moment is fading into history itself. Right. Yeah,
it's an interesting thing, though, isn't it? Because when I first came over here to study Southern history, largely with what was really the American left, and people like Steve Hahn and Stephen McCurry, they were heavily invested in British historiography. I remember when the Journal of American History did a survey, and they asked people, tell us your top 3 most important influences among historians. Number 1 was E.P. Thompson. I mean, incredible, really. And then Eric Hobsbawm was close behind. I think there was a bunch of Southern historians were looking across the pond for a kind of intellectual and theoretical inspiration that then they incorporated here. And you can see it very clearly, I think, in all of that work in the 1990s and 1980s in particular. So, okay, before we get too far down that road, and I think it's a very interesting conversation, let's talk about some of the work that you did on Southern history in particular. So, not your first, but certainly probably the most noted book is Fight Against Fear, Southern Jews and Black Civil Rights. That's 2003, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So what was the basic thrust of that book? I mean, and how did you get into that topic?
I was interested in civil rights history, as were so many British scholars, and wanted to find a different approach to studying it. There was very much a vogue at the time for case studies of individual communities or states, yes, and looking at grassroots activism. I felt that had been cornered by John Kirk and Stephen Tuck and George Lewis et al. There were a whole host of young British scholars who were working in that area. So I wanted to do something different, and I was particularly interested in the role of white liberals in movement activism. And through that line of inquiry, I then came upon the fact that there's a disproportionately large number of Jews who've been active in the movement. And, with my customary perversity, rather than focus on those northern Jewish liberals who had engaged in direct action, I decided to look at the small minority of southern Jews, many of whom kept out of the struggle for a number of complicated reasons. So in other words, it was just a series of lines of inquiry that led me to that topic in the end.
And did you find this Southern Jewish presence to be surprisingly large?
I mean, I suppose, like a lot of people, I was unaware in the first instance that there was any Jewish presence in the American South. I just, sort of Jews as being synonymous with large northern metropolitan areas, New York, Chicago, and so forth. So that was surprising in itself. And there, what I found, of course, that there were actually quite large concentrations of Jews in some cities, like Atlanta, for example.
And Charleston, right?
Charleston, yeah. And historically, of course, the Jewish community of Charleston, one of the oldest in the United States. So actually, the Jewish experience was very much rooted in the longer history of the American South.
So what was your takeaway after kind of identifying these Jewish communities, of kind of evaluating how they interacted in the civil rights movement and did or didn't? What would be your principal conclusion?
My principal conclusion was that most Jews did not become actively involved in the civil rights struggle because of the upsurge of anti-Semitism that occurred at the time, which immobilized them. They didn't feel that they had the sufficient numbers, the political leverage to be able to contribute positively without suffering recrimination to themselves. But that there were nonetheless a small but dedicated number of Southern Jews who did overcome that anxiety and fear and made meaningful contributions, both in particular rabbis who led a very kind of strong moral crusade in support of civil rights, and women activists who were particularly engaged in school desegregation.
How did those folks, how were they received in the African American civil rights movement?
I think they were received favorably. Martin Luther King, for instance, had a very strong relationship with Rabbi Jacob Rothschild in Atlanta. And they were received well in part because they met an expectation that African Americans had. I think after the experience of the Second World War and the Holocaust, to read the writings by major civil rights leaders, there was an assumption that Jews, as people who had suffered terrible injustice and oppression and persecution, would naturally come to the support of the civil rights cause. So when some Southern Jews did, they were greeted with open arms.
When you talk about the rise of anti-Semitism in the context of the civil rights movement and Jewish involvement in it, what's your kind of metric for that? How did you identify it, and when did it really begin? And did it kind of tag and parallel the actual civil rights movement? Is that how this worked?
Yes, I mean, there is one way to quantify it, which is the number of attacks that took place on Jewish religious institutions, community centers, synagogues. There's a wave of terrorist attacks that occur in 1957 and 1958 bomb.
So that's early, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is early.
Yeah.
And it's in part to do with a belief. It's rooted really in white racism, an assumption that African Americans don't possess the necessary intelligence and enterprise to be able to organize their own movement of protest against Jim Crow. And therefore, somebody else has to be behind this. Right. And the belief on the part of many segregationists is that it's Jews. Jews who are attempting to destabilize the South, undermine democracy, and who will profit from the fallout of that. Yeah,
it makes perfect sense to me. I did a book years ago on the construction of race in the American South, and I ended it in 1954-55, a bit outside of my area, but I was just intrigued and I wanted to bookend it there. And to do that, I went and looked at correspondence sent to governors in every southern state, and the number of anti-Semitic letters that were also anti-African American, they were braided. And I think you're entirely right. I think it's a very keen insight. And to kind of take the Jewish experience out of that really leaves us with a much impoverished understanding of the civil rights movement. All right, so then you turn to the extreme right in Rabble, Rousers, which was a well-received book and earned some commentary, didn't it? Did you get some? Well, how was it received for you, from your perspective, as you're sitting in Sussex? So hang on a minute, what are they saying about my book?
I think the first time I knew that the book was going to get a certain kind of reaction is when I met a professor at the University of Mississippi called Charles Eagles,
yes,
whose work I admired greatly, who said to me, it was a very brave book to write, which is coded language for, maybe you shouldn't have written it.
Yeah, right. So before we get into that, can you just tell us what it was? What did you do with this book that proved controversial? What was the subject matter?
So the book really was intended as a sequel of sorts to Fight Against Fear. It was my attempt to understand the white racial extremists who had engaged in particular in acts of violence against African Americans and Jews in an attempt to resist civil rights reform. Some of those figures had turned up in the pages of Fight Against Fear, but I wanted to actually try and, in no way empathize with them, but try to understand what had shaped them.
Yeah.
And the reason why the book was controversial for some people was that some critics thought that I was doing too much to humanize people who were beyond the pale, essentially. I wasn't trying in any way to legitimate their actions. These are repugnant people who engaged in appalling behavior, several of whom had blood on their hands. But I thought it was, it seemed to me an important exercise to try and understand what shapes people like that, and and the fact that that white racists still operate in different capacities around the world. I thought this would be a possible lesson from history that could be used to understand more contemporary manifestations of racism.
I think Professor Eagles was entirely right to characterize this as a brave and a kind of courageous move. It reminds me of when Drew Faust started to look at James Henry Hammond. And in no way was she endorsing it, but we have to understand the mindset, because if we don't understand that, none of their actions make any sense, and then none of the history makes any sense. So it is courageous, and I take my hat off to you. Who did you look at for that book? There were 5 people, right?
Yeah, so I looked at an individual called John Casper, who was the most interesting for me of the 5 personalities. He was a graduate of Columbia University, an admirer of the poet Ezra Pound. Something of a very troubled individual, and somebody who I'd learned about because he was imitated in incomparable fashion by the great William Shatner in a film called The Intruder, which came out in the late 1950s, a fictionalized account of John Casper's efforts to mobilize grassroots opposition to school desegregation in Tennessee. It's actually a very good film. It's made by Roger Corman, who's more renowned for kind of cheap horror movies, Edgar Allan Poe adaptations and the like. But it's an example of cinema verite. It's a gritty, black and white piece of social realism with an actually quite commanding performance by Shatner. This is before the days that he got corrupted by playing Captain Kirk, when I think he was still trying to be a serious actor.
Well, I never. So Shatner.
It's worth watching. And he plays a fictionalized version of Casper in that. I think it's called Adam Kramer, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
That's based in turn on a novel by Charles Beaumont called The Intruder.
Okay.
So he's the most interesting of the characters, and then there's John Cromlin, who is a decorated senior military officer who's active in Alabama. J.B. Stoner, who's essentially a Nazi in Georgia. Bryant Bowles, another kind of itinerant white racist who's engaged in trying to resist school desegregation, in his case in Delaware. I think what the thing with all of the characters in the and then there's John Cromlin. Sorry, not John Cromlin. There's Edwin Walker, who is another military officer, who is probably most infamous today for the fact that he's somebody who Lee Harvey Oswald took a shot at. It's kind of target practice. And I think what I did with the book and why I think it became controversial was I wanted to move beyond the idea that these people were just crazy.
Right.
And I wanted to try and find a sociological and historical explanation for what had motivated them and what had enabled them to mobilize large numbers of people to engage in acts of massive resistance. Because
they did, didn't they? I mean, they were quite successful in mobilizing. They were the Rabble Rousers.
I mean, it's worth in the case of Bryant Bowles, for instance, effectively stopped school desegregation in the community where he was active.
Right.
I mean, he pulled it off.
Yep.
So they're not people who I think should be underestimated. But I wanted to pull them out of the political margins so to explain why they were able to mobilize grassroots support in the way that they did, and also to look for explanations beyond the idea that they were just, mad, they were deviants. And what I concluded was that their ideology was although a distortion of political mainstream ideas in the United States, still grew out of those ideas. So in other words, that they were not an aberration from, but a kind of distortion of American political ideology. And I think that's where some people took exception to what I was saying.
And I think that's actually a good thing. I mean, you're opening up the debate, and that's the nature of the beast. So I applaud you for it. What did these men have in common? What was I'm sure you, as a sociological treatment, you were trying to look at things that they shared, right? What were some of those things?
I think, in the case of what they didn't share was I don't think any of them were really attention seekers. I don't think that they were suffering from any mental ill health or anything of that kind at all. What they shared, I suppose, fundamentally was a belief, first of all, a belief that they were patriots, that they were upholding traditions that were sacred to American society, and that they were trying to protect local communities and the nation at large from forces that threatened to undo American democracy as they understood it.
Right.
And they all saw themselves really as having inherited the ideas and traditions of the founding fathers. They looked back to the founding of the American Republic and saw themselves very much as part of a historical trajectory dating from the 18th century forwards. That they were the inheritors of that tradition. Yeah. So rather than being un-American,
right,
people who were bringing down democracy, they were the ones upholding it. So, in other words, although we might think of them as being marginal figures, they saw themselves as actually embodying the political mainstream.
Who did they appeal to most often, Clive? Was it a Jeffersonian appeal or a Madisonian one or Washington? So clearly it's not anybody beyond that. This reminds me of the debate in 1860-61 who are the real heirs of the American Revolution? Is it the South or is it the North? Who are these guys appealing to, or are they not? Is it more implicit than that, or are they kind of politically explicit in their appeals to certain individuals?
Well, they're certainly rooted in Jeffersonian ideas of republicanism. That's a common strain throughout all of them. In terms of who they appealed to, I think that most of the support that they commanded was white working class support, people who believed that they were effectively disfranchised. But what I argued in the book was they were also a convenient political foil for the more mainstream white political establishment, because essentially what their extremism did was it allowed elected politicians to position themselves as being somehow more responsible, that they were pursuing more legal strategies as a means to withstand civil rights reform. So in that sense, they were actually politically very convenient for the establishment.
Yeah, I like that argument a lot. It makes a lot of sense to me. And it's kind of obvious, but people don't really articulate it very often. And also, weren't they very especially critical of things like local chamber of commerce and businesses, that they had been betrayed the South in some fashion? If I remember correctly, it's been a while since I looked at the book, but wasn't that one of the big thrusts of in other words, they go beyond just states' rights. I mean, they're not just states' rights thinkers. They're actually looking at the political economy of their world, and they're identifying not just African American civil rights as a threat, but the white shareholders in that, or at least the quiet white shareholders, that is to say, business, right? I mean, is that an accurate description?
Very much so. So they, as that whole process of the transformation of the U.S. economy is occurring, as Southern regionalism is eroding as a result of the spread of multinational corporations and so forth. There's a sense that's not just breaking down the social order, but it's also disempowering ordinary white Southern folk. And
breaking down the South.
Yeah.
The South is becoming a much hazier place to them, right?
Yeah, it's almost becoming a satellite, like a kind of colonial satellite.
Yeah, which has always been their fear, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the same argument made in the antebellum period. So there's always been that fear of becoming a colonial dependency to an industrialized, more robust economically North, right? And you're just seeing this again in the 50s and 60s, yeah.
Yeah, so it's this notion really that the indigenous population is losing control, that they're outsiders who, and a lot of those corporate interests in their minds become identified with Jews again. The kind of the eternal outsider. But there's a strong sense that they impart that these outside forces are imposing a kind of control over the region that is undermining the individual and collective autonomy of the white South.
Sure. Makes perfect sense. The parallel here is kind of interesting. As you, as a scholar, are moving away from the South, it's becoming diluted for the very things that you're studying. I'm not sure if it's cause and effect, but I note the parallel with some interest. Before we get on to what your next project is, I want to circle back onto this question of folks like you who teach Southern history and US history in the UK, and let's explore some of the reasons why the heyday is perhaps on the wane. And that is, of course, we're not really commenting on the quality of the work that's being produced today in the UK on the American South, which is of a very high quality. Tim Lockley, Emily West, David Doddington, they're producing significant works on the South that's still vibrant. But I think you're right that the heyday is gone. What it looks like in the future, we don't know. But can you explain some of the kind of intricacies and academic imperatives that might be behind that slight declension?
I think it's harder to study the United States broadly and the South specifically for a number of reasons. One of them has to do with money.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at the root of all of this, and that is that the research agenda in UK higher education has changed over the course of the last several years, and there's a particular premium that is now placed on the impact of your work. Mm-hmm. So it's not sufficient to produce quality scholarship. Mm-hmm. It has to reach an audience beyond the academy and actually, change hearts and minds.
Okay.
Which
you're doing right now, Clive. This is your impact factor. This is it.
Will the managers of my university kindly note? So it is, as you can imagine, if you are a scholar based 3,000 miles away from the United States, separated by an ocean, it is much more difficult for you to engage in the logistical work that would facilitate the impact of your research. Mm-hmm. You probably, you're just not going to be as professionally well connected with people in the media, with museums, with other kind of potential partners. And it's now the case that with nearly all funding applications for research projects, you have to demonstrate the potential impact that the project will have. So that is an almost insurmountable challenge, I think, for most British scholars of the United States. It's far easier, obviously, if you're based in your community, to find a partnership with a museum or a heritage foundation or whatever else it might be that's close to you, that you can develop a close personal relationship with. So in that sense, trying to secure funding is more difficult for the very kind of projects that arguably most need the money, because to engage in overseas research is a more expensive enterprise than it is if you're just looking at something within the immediate confines of the community where you live and work. So that's an unfortunate scenario. So I think it's becoming harder to find the financial resources to be able to do the research. That it's not saying that people don't still win money from the British Academy and other grant awarding bodies, but it's difficult, and it's also affecting in terms of the kind of of a new generation of scholars. Funding for PhD students is scarcer now than it ever has been. Incredibly competitive. And the truth of the matter is that American-related projects tend not to get supported as well as others do. I mean, it's worth, for anyone listening to this who's saying, well, what about me? I'm a historian of France or the Middle East or whatever. The same applies. Yeah. But I think what you've got, in other words, is a bias towards British history projects. Yeah.
And probably an unintended consequence of the reconfiguration of the funding mechanisms in the UK. But they chose this path, and now we're seeing some of the less than dividends of this, right? It's made it more insular rather than more global. Yeah,
absolutely.
And that's a great shame. I do hasten to note, though, that you've had enormous success with Lever Hume and British Academy and other. You've managed to figure this out. But I should imagine it's very challenging for junior scholars to make that kind of claim and get that kind of funding if they're doing US history in a British university.
It's really hard. Yeah, it really is hard. And we're also seeing, we're sadly seeing, I think there's a huge interest still in American history in Britain, but we are seeing a decline overall as well at an undergraduate level. American studies programs are starting to disappear.
Really? Interesting.
It's anticipated that they will probably all have closed within the next 10 to 15 years.
Is that right?
So that younger generation of scholars is going to, they're going to struggle to come through, I think, in the same way.
Well, that's a shame, and quite depressing. All right, well, this leads us to Clive Webb. What's he doing now, and what's he thinking about doing?
Well, what I'm doing now is I've just written a draft of a book that has nothing at all to do with the American South. And that book came about in part because of COVID. That I, as you mentioned, Mark, I had funding for a project that had a substantial Southern component to it, which was looking at the lynching of foreign nationals, much of which occurred in the South. And I was very excited about the project. Then COVID happened, and that ruined all of my travel plans. I couldn't go anywhere to do any of the work. So the project got stalled. Tempted as I was to do absolutely nothing, but sit at home while the pandemic was ongoing. I started work on another project, which is essentially it's a narrative history, but it's about the Vietnam War, and it's about the efforts of a number of intellectuals led by Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre to organize an international tribunal that would put the American government in effect on trial for war crimes that they alleged it was committing in Vietnam.
Okay. Wow. Nimble and ambitious. How's that coming along?
Well, I've written the book in draft. It's going to be a trade book, so it's with an editor. I've gone through the usual kind of succession of disasters that people can have with books. So I had an editor who then left the press. I have a new editor. He's just had his first child. So there's a whole series of events that have taken place, which means I'm waiting with trepidation to find out what he thinks of it. But the plan is that the book will come out in 2025.
Well, if anybody can pull it off, you can. Clive Webb, thank you for being on Take on the South.
Thank you so much, Mark.